In the summer of 1943, as the dust settled over the Eastern Front, German tank crews still felt a deep sense of superiority. The war had turned brutal, yes, but in their minds, the Panzer divisions remained the embodiment of modern warfare. The Tiger Eye and the Panther were symbols of invincibility, machines of steel and precision that had crushed anything the Soviets could throw at them. To most Wehrmacht officers, the Red Army was a blunt instrument, relying on sheer numbers, not sophistication. And when Soviet tanks were mentioned, they often came with laughter. They'd break down before they even reached the front, some would say. Their guns cannot pierce our armor. That arrogance was not just pride, it was doctrine. The German war machine had been built on the idea that technical mastery would always outweigh manpower and improvisation. For 2 years, that belief had held true. During the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union, panzer columns rolled forward like a dark tide, swallowing entire divisions and leaving trails of burning villages behind them. Soviet tanks like the T-26, BT-7, or even the once feared KV-1 were either too slow, too clumsy, or simply outnumbered and outgunned. The Germans believed they had already seen the best that the Soviets could produce. They thought the Red Army's factories were exhausted, its engineers untrained, its morale shattered. By 1943, after the victory at Kharkov and the defensive success at Kursk, German tank commanders were convinced that the war in the East could still be stabilized, that their technology could keep the Red Army in check indefinitely. The Tiger tank embodied that confidence. Its thick armor, long-range gun, and terrifying presence gave German crews the illusion of control. From the open steppes of Ukraine to the forests of Belarus, wherever the Tigers appeared, they dominated the battlefield. Soviet tank crews often avoided direct confrontation, preferring to swarm the Germans with numbers or lure them into traps. The Germans, in turn, began to believe that nothing new could surprise them. They had seen everything, so they thought. Yet in the factories east of the Urals, far from the front lines, the Soviet Union was quietly building something that would make even the most seasoned panzer commander question that certainty. The birth of the IS series of heavy tanks came from necessity and revenge. After the brutal encounters with the Tigers and Panthers, Soviet engineers knew that their existing designs were reaching their limits. They needed something that could not only withstand the German 88 guns, but destroy their armored giants in a single strike. In the industrial city of Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankograd, or Tank City, teams of engineers worked through the night, fusing lessons from the KV series with new innovations in armor and weaponry. The project was personally supported by Stalin himself, who demanded a heavy tank that could break the backbone of the German beast. The result would soon carry his initials, IS, for Iosif Stalin, but in mid-1943, the Germans had no idea what was coming. On the front lines, they mocked the Soviet attempts at heavy armor, calling them rolling bunkers. In reports sent back to Berlin, officers dismissed rumors of a new Soviet tank as propaganda. Confidence radiated from the German high command. Even as the Red Army regrouped and their numbers grew, the Wehrmacht believed its superior tactics and elite armor would keep the Eastern Front from collapsing. The war, in their minds, was a contest of engineering, and they still held the crown. Among German tank crews, there was even a kind of grim pride in the challenge. For every Tiger we lose, one commander boasted, the Russians must sacrifice 10 of theirs. They trusted in their optics, in their accuracy, in their carefully maintained engines. The idea that the Soviets could produce a machine of equal or greater quality seemed laughable. After all, the Tiger was more than a tank, it was a myth. To many, it felt as if nothing on earth could pierce its armor or outgun its cannon. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most disciplined armies. The Germans measured their worth by machinery and forgot the lesson the Soviets had learned the hard way. Quantity and simplicity, when combined with determination, could become unstoppable. As the Red Army rebuilt and rearmanned, its engineers worked under impossible conditions, freezing workshops, shortages of materials, and constant air raids. Yet they continued to design, weld, and test. Each failure made the next prototype stronger, and somewhere deep in the Urals, A massive turret was being forged, one that could mount a gun larger than anything Germany had dared to put on a tank. Back on the front, the German crews noticed subtle changes in the Soviet tactics. The enemy seemed bolder, their armored formations tighter and better coordinated. Soviet units that once hesitated now attacked in synchronized waves, supported by artillery barrages that stretched for miles. There were whispers among the troops, rumors of a new kind of heavy tank appearing on the horizon, capable of surviving direct hits from a Tiger. The veterans dismissed it, laughing as they cleaned their 88 guns. If it exists, they said, we'll burn it like all the others. They didn't know that the Red Army had already begun field testing the IS-1, a prototype for something far more dangerous. Soviet commanders were learning how to use heavy armor not just for defense, but for breakthrough. They envisioned a tank that could lead assaults through the toughest resistance, crushing bunkers and panzers alike. And when the IS-2 finally rolled out of Tankograd, its designers knew it would not just match German engineering, it would surpass it through brute force and simplicity. But all of that was still ahead. In the late months of 1943, German officers still smiled when Soviet tanks were mentioned. They laughed around campfires, confident in their steel monsters and their experience. They believed they understood their enemy completely. The Eastern Front was brutal, yes, but predictable. The panzers ruled the battlefield. The Wehrmacht held the advantage. The Red Army, in their minds, was still a lumbering, inefficient machine, too crude, too chaotic to produce anything new. They could not have known that deep behind Soviet lines, the hammering of steel was creating something that would soon erase that confidence forever. Within months, the laughter of German soldiers would turn to disbelief as they watched shells bounce off a tank they couldn't stop, a tank that didn't care about precision or perfection, only about crushing everything in its path. The panzer crews didn't realize it yet, but the age of German dominance on the Eastern Front was about to end, and it would end not with a whisper, but with the thunder of the IS-2. By the end of 1943, as the snows of the Eastern Front began to thicken once more, deep inside the Soviet Union, a new monster was being born. The Red Army had endured unimaginable losses, millions of soldiers dead, cities turned to ash, factories bombed into dust, but it had also learned. Every destroyed tank, every burned column of metal had taught its engineers something new. The lessons of the battlefield were written in steel, and the Soviets were ready to rewrite the rules of armored warfare. The enemy had the Tiger. They would build something that could kill the Tiger. The birthplace of this idea was Chelyabinsk, a massive industrial city hidden in the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. It was known as Tankograd, literally Tank City. Here, under freezing temperatures and constant shortages, engineers, workers, and even civilians lived and slept beside assembly lines. Entire families were involved in the production effort. Women operated welding torches while children carried bolts and steel parts from one section to another. Dating, it was not just a factory, it was a war organism, beating day and night, breathing smoke and fire. Among the engineers was Joseph Kotin, one of the Soviet Union's most brilliant tank designers. He had already worked on the KV series, a heavy tank that had initially terrified the Germans in 1941, but had become obsolete once the Tiger appeared. Now, Kotin and his team were ordered to do the impossible: create a tank that could stand against the Tiger's gun, resist its shells, and still move fast enough to outmaneuver it. Stalin himself had demanded results. In one meeting, he is said to have remarked coldly, "The Germans have their beast. We will forge our own." The project was given top priority and a name that carried weight: IS, the initials of Iosif Stalin. Every decision made in Tankograd came from necessity. The Soviets didn't have the luxury of precision engineering or rare materials like the Germans. What they had was ingenuity and speed. They built their tanks not for perfection, but for survival. They wanted a weapon that could be mass-produced, repaired in the field, and driven by men with little formal training. The IS would be the evolution of that philosophy, a tank built not in comfort but in desperation. The design process was brutal. Engineers had to combine the lessons learned from the KV and T-34 while addressing the most critical weakness of Soviet armor, firepower. The T-34's 76 gun was no longer enough. German Tigers could destroy Soviet tanks from more than a kilometer away. To stand a chance, the IS needed something extraordinary, a cannon capable of punching through a Tiger's frontal armor. Soviet engineers looked toward their artillery units and found an answer in an unlikely place: the 122 A-19 field gun. It was a weapon designed to destroy fortifications, not tanks, but its sheer power was unmatched. If they could fit it inside a turret, it would change everything. Fitting it, however, was not easy. The gun was enormous, its shells massive and heavy. The recoil threatened to tear the turret apart. Coton's team had to redesign the internal structure entirely, reinforcing the mountings and modifying the turret's shape. They also used sloped armor inspired by the T-34's revolutionary design. Instead of simply thickening the plates, they angled them so that incoming shells would ricochet rather than penetrate. The result was a combination of brute force and clever geometry, a balance of offense and defense unseen in any tank before it. In late 1943, the first prototype, known as the IS-85, rolled out for testing. It was a crude beast, weighing nearly 45 tons, its armor scarred and unpainted. Yet it was fast for its size, and its 85 gun performed admirably. But the Red Army was impatient. Reports from the front were grim. The Tigers were cutting through Soviet armor like paper. Stalin demanded more firepower. The engineers returned to their drawing boards, replacing the gun with the monstrous 122 D-25 T cannon. When the first round fired, the sound shook the ground like thunder. It could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor at 2 kilometers. The barrel smoked, the recoil threw dust into the air, and everyone in the test field stood in silence. The monster had spoken. Still, there were problems. The huge shells made loading slow, often requiring 2 men and taking precious seconds in combat. Munition capacity was limited. Just 28 rounds could fit inside the tank. But the Soviets didn't care. They weren't building a duelist's weapon. They were building a tank for breakthrough. The IS-2 was meant to smash through enemy defenses, destroy bunkers, and obliterate whatever stood in front of it. A few seconds between shots didn't matter when each shell could tear a Tiger in half. The testing continued under extreme conditions: mud, snow, ice, and sand. The IS-2 had to prove it could move where other tanks failed. Its wide tracks gave it a surprising advantage in rough terrain, and its diesel engine, inherited from the T-34, made it reliable and easy to repair. The Soviets didn't just test it, they punished it. They fired at its armor from every angle, tried to blow it up with mines, and forced it through rivers and swamps. Each time, the tank emerged battered but alive. It was ready for war. In early 1944, production began in earnest. The first IS-2 units were sent to elite guards regiments, the spearhead of Soviet offensives. The crews were hand-picked, men who had survived years of brutal fighting. When they saw their new tank for the first time, they were stunned. It was bigger, heavier, and more intimidating than anything they had ever driven. The 122 gun looked almost absurdly large, like an artillery piece mounted on a tank. They called it the sledgehammer. Meanwhile, German intelligence began intercepting reports of a new heavy Soviet tank. At first, these were dismissed as exaggerations or misidentifications. The German high command believed no Soviet tank could possibly surpass the Tiger in firepower. But the first photos soon arrived: grainy reconnaissance images showing a massive silhouette with a long barrel and thick, sloped armor. Analysts in Berlin grew silent. The shape didn't match anything they had seen before. The Tiger's dominance was being challenged, and they knew it. The Soviets didn't care for secrecy anymore. By mid-1944, as IS-2s began appearing near the front, they made sure the Germans saw them. They wanted fear to travel ahead of them. The Red Army had learned to use psychological warfare. Rumors of a tank that could shrug off an 88 hit began to spread among German units. Soldiers whispered about shells bouncing harmlessly off a new Soviet monster. And when the IS-2 finally rolled into battle, it did not sneak, it roared. Its first engagements near Korsun and later in Operation Bagration stunned the German lines. Villages and strongholds that had withstood months of fighting were obliterated in hours. The tank's enormous shells reduced bunkers to rubble and sent Tigers retreating. Soviet commanders used them like battering rams, smashing through fortified lines while infantry poured through the breaches. For the Germans, the first encounter was disbelief. Their proud Tigers fired first, confident as always, but watched in horror as their shots ricocheted off the IS-2's armor. Then came the retaliation, one deafening blast that turned their steel masterpiece into a fireball. What had once been the symbol of German dominance was now being hunted by something stronger, simpler, and more ruthless. The birth of the IS-2 was not just the creation of a tank, it was the end of an era. The laughter that had echoed around German camps in 1941 was long gone. In its place came silence and the distant thunder of a new Soviet weapon that would soon roll all the way to Berlin. The first time German soldiers saw an IS-2 on the battlefield, they didn't even know what they were looking at. It was early 1944, near the Ukrainian front. Snow covered the fields in a dull white blanket, broken only by the black silhouettes of burned-out vehicles. A German reconnaissance patrol spotted something moving through the mist, a tank, but larger than anything they had seen before. It rolled slowly, confidently, its massive guns sweeping side to side like the gaze of a predator. The radio crackled as the observer tried to describe it. Different, he said. It's bigger than a KV. It's enormous. Command dismissed it as a misidentification. But soon more reports followed. Something new was on the Eastern Front. At first, German officers refused to believe the stories. How could the Soviets, whose factories had been bombed relentlessly, whose railways were shattered, possibly produce a new tank superior to the Tiger? To the German high command, the very idea was absurd. They assumed it was propaganda, a morale tactic to frighten their troops. But on the ground, the tank crews knew better. They had seen the thing with their own eyes. It wasn't a rumor, it was a nightmare made real. One of the earliest direct encounters came near the town of Sarny. A Tiger platoon from the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion was holding a defensive line when Soviet forces launched a counterattack. At first, it was routine. The Germans sighted T-34s and Su-85s moving across the fields. They opened fire, confident as always. But then, a larger silhouette emerged from behind the smoke. Its outline was unfamiliar, the turret thicker, the gun longer. The German commander aimed and fired. The shell struck the front plate and bounced. A spark, a clang, but no penetration. The Soviet tank stopped, turned its massive turret, and fired back. The German crew barely had time to realize what was happening before their Tiger exploded in a ball of flame. Word spread quickly. The Germans had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, but now, for the first time, they faced something that could kill them with a single shot. Reports from the front described this new enemy as a monster with a cannon the size of an artillery gun. Intelligence officers tried to match it with known Soviet designs but failed. Some even believed it was a modified version of the KV-85. The truth was worse. The Soviets had built something entirely new. In the days that followed, German units began encountering IS-2s more frequently. They appeared in small numbers, usually leading armored assaults. Their presence was unmistakable. When they fired, the ground trembled. Their shells could blast through a Panther's frontal armor or shatter a bunker's wall with ease. The 122 gun wasn't just a tank weapon, it was an earthquake contained within steel. German soldiers quickly learned to recognize its sound, a deep, thunderous crack that echoed across miles of frozen terrain. At first, they tried to fight them the same way they fought T-34. aim for the side armor, use coordinated ambushes, rely on mobility. But the IS-2 didn't play by those rules. Its sloped armor deflected most hits, and its sheer weight made it unstoppable in ramming maneuvers. Even when immobilized, it could still fight like a fortress, turning its turret and firing until the end. Some German crews, unable to damage them, resorted to desperation calling in artillery or air support to destroy what their guns could not. One German officer described the encounter in his diary. "We thought the Russians had run out of ideas. We were wrong. Their new tank laughs at our shells. Its gun tears through our armor like paper. For the first time, we feel hunted." Fear began to spread quietly among the troops. It wasn't just about the tank itself, it was what it represented. The Germans had long considered the Soviets inferior in technology. Facing Anne, this too shattered that illusion. Here was a tank that proved the enemy had learned, adapted, and evolved. Every destroyed Tiger or Panther became a symbol of that shift. The Eastern Front was no longer a contest between advanced engineering and brute force. It had become a duel of equals. And that realization chilled even the most seasoned veterans. The psychological impact was enormous. Entire German positions began retreating when IS-2s appeared. Anti-tank units already stretched thin had little to stop them. The 75 mm pack guns were useless. Even the powerful 88 mm flak guns struggled against its thick frontal armor. The only reliable way to destroy an IS-2 was to hit it from the sides or rear, but to do so, a crew had to survive long enough to flank it, a suicidal task. Meanwhile, Soviet morale soared. For years, Red Army tankers had suffered humiliation at the hands of the Tigers and Panthers. Now, for the first time, they felt invincible. Crews painted slogans on their turrets. "For Moscow, for Stalingrad, for my brother who died in Kursk." They advanced without fear, knowing that their armor could withstand the worst the enemy could offer. Some IS-2 units became legendary within weeks of combat, earning reputations as unstoppable forces. By the spring of 1944, the IS-2 was no longer a secret. The Germans began adjusting their tactics, ordering ambushes from greater distances and focusing artillery fire on suspected heavy tank routes. But no matter what they tried, the Soviet beasts kept coming. The IS-2's combination of thick armor and devastating firepower made it the perfect spearhead for the massive Soviet offensives that were now pushing westward. In one engagement during Operation Bagration, German defenses collapsed after just a few hours under IS-2 assault. Bunkers crumbled, anti-tank positions vanished, and once stable front lines were overrun. Survivors described the scene as apocalyptic. One soldier recalled, "It wasn't just tanks, it was as if the earth itself was moving toward us." For the first time since 1941, German crews found themselves completely on the defensive. The panzers that once dictated the pace of war were now reacting, retreating, surviving. The IS-2 had flipped the psychological balance. Soviet tankers were now the hunters, and the Germans, once proud of their steel, became prey. By the summer of 1944, the name Stalin tank had become infamous. German intelligence issued special briefings instructing soldiers on how to fight them: aim for the lower hull, target the rear engine deck, use close-range Panzerfausts. But even then, soldiers dreaded the idea of facing one head-on. Many preferred to withdraw rather than engage. For the first time, German units were evacuating towns and defensive positions, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of a single machine. When the first captured IS-2s were inspected by German engineers, the reaction was disbelief. The design was elegant in its simplicity. The armor was angled perfectly, the gun mount reinforced, the interior spacious enough for combat efficiency. One officer reportedly muttered, "This is better than ours." The engineers realized something the soldiers already knew: the balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The IS-2 had not only appeared, it had announced itself as the new master of the battlefield. The fear it inspired would ripple through every German division. forcing them to adapt, rebuild, and rethink everything they believed about warfare. And as the Soviets advanced westward, that dark shape on the horizon, the silhouette of an IS-2 rolling through smoke, became a symbol of the coming end. The laughter of 1941 had turned to silence, and in that silence, the thunder of the IS-2's gun echoed like an omen of doom. When the IS-2 first fired in battle, soldiers on both sides could feel it, not just hear it, but feel it deep in their chest, like the earth itself had groaned in pain. The roar of its 122 mm D-25T cannon didn't sound like any tank gun before it. It wasn't a sharp crack like the German 88 mm, but a thunderous, drawn-out explosion that rolled across the fields and echoed through forests. The shock wave shattered windows, stirred clouds of dust, and sent flocks of birds scattering into the gray sky. Was not a sound of precision. It was a sound of raw power. The D-25T wasn't designed for tank warfare. It was originally a field gun and artillery piece meant to destroy concrete fortifications and heavy bunkers. But in the desperate winters of the Eastern Front, the Soviet engineers had done what they always did: adapt. They had taken this massive weapon and forced it into the belly of a tank. That was an engineering gamble that no Western army would have dared to attempt, and yet it worked. The IS-2's gun could pierce 120 millimeters of armor at 2 kilometers, and even when it didn't penetrate, the sheer impact of the shell could rip a turret from its mount or crush a tank crew inside through concussive force alone. German tankers soon learned that distance no longer guaranteed safety. In earlier battles, Tigers and Panthers could sit a kilometer away and pick off Soviet tanks with impunity. The IS-2 changed that. Its shells had terrifying range and accuracy for their size. The first time a Tiger exploded from a hit it thought impossible, German commanders understood something had changed forever. Their heavy armor on Ridger, their greatest advantage was now their coffin. The Soviets were not known for subtlety, and the IS-2 embodied that perfectly. Its gun fired slowly, only 2 or 3 rounds per minute. But that was enough. Soviet tankers joked grimly, "We don't need to shoot fast, we only need to shoot once." And it was true. A single hit could turn a Panther into a fireball or collapse a fortified position. In urban combat, IS-2s leveled entire buildings to root out snipers. On open fields, their shells created craters wide enough for a man to hide inside. There was something almost primal about the weapon's violence. Crews described the recoil as a living force. The whole tank shuddered backward when it fired, kicking up waves of snow or mud. Inside, the loader's arms ached from the weight of the shells, each one as heavy as a man's leg. The commander shouted orders over the ringing in his ears while the gunner adjusted for range, smoke filling the turret. Outside, enemy troops who survived the blast described feeling disoriented, unable to tell where the shot had come from. It wasn't just firepower, it was psychological warfare. The Germans began calling the IS-2 the bunker buster. Even entrenched positions that had held for weeks crumbled in minutes when its shells landed. The front lines that once required days of artillery preparation could now be broken by a handful of IS-2 advancing side by side, their cannons roaring in unison. The Red Army used them like siege engines, not merely as tanks, but as moving artillery batteries. In assaults on fortified towns, an IS-2 would roll forward, take aim at a key strongpoint, and erase it with one blast. Infantry would then rush through the hole, and the process repeated. Entire German battalions were wiped out by this brutal rhythm. For the German soldiers inside bunkers or behind anti-tank guns, the experience was pure terror. The moment an IS-2 appeared on the horizon, most men froze. Their usual weapons, the 50 mm and 75 mm guns, were useless. Even the feared 88 mm flak guns could fail if they didn't hit the right spot. Many units resorted to ambush tactics, hiding in forests or ruins and waiting for a side shot, but the IS-2's armor was cunningly angled. Even glancing hits often bounced away harmlessly. To make matters worse, Soviet crews had begun applying extra layers of track links and spare parts on the hull, creating improvised armor that made the tank even tougher. German intelligence quickly analyzed captured IS-2s to find weaknesses. They discovered that the armor was thick but not uniform. The front was nearly invincible, but the sides and rear could be penetrated by heavy guns at close range. Orders went out across the front. Do not engage head-on. Surround and attack from behind. But in the chaos of battle, few ever got that chance. The IS-2 rarely fought alone. It advanced with T-34s and infantry support, a rolling wall of steel backed by thousands of men. Trying to flank one was like running into a storm. To the Soviets, the D-25T gun became a symbol of justice. For every burned-out Soviet tank left behind in 1941 and 1942, they now had a weapon that could exact revenge. Veterans who had watched their friends die in the early days of the war felt an almost personal satisfaction every time their shells hit a German Tiger. "We were not afraid anymore," one Soviet gunner recalled. "When we fired, the Germans hid. That was new to us." On the tactical level, the IS-2's firepower changed the way the Red Army fought. Instead of using tanks purely for breakthrough and pursuit, commanders now built combined arms operations around their heavy regiments. Before each assault, the IS-2s would take up positions and bombard enemy lines, destroying strong points and demoralizing defenders. Then the T-34s would sweep in to finish the job. The Germans had once used this doctrine effectively with their Tigers. Now it was the Soviets' turn. Even in defense, the IS-2 was formidable. When positioned hull down behind terrain, only its thick turret was exposed, and its long-range accuracy allowed it to strike with deadly precision. German reconnaissance planes often mistook them for artillery pieces because of the enormous muzzle flash. Entire German attacks were halted by a single platoon of IS-2s hidden in the woods, picking off advancing tanks one by one. Yet for all its might, the IS-2 had flaws. Its rate of fire remained painfully slow, and its limited ammunition made prolonged engagements dangerous. Reloading under pressure was exhausting, and in close combat, the tank could be overwhelmed by faster German vehicles if caught alone. But the Soviets compensated with numbers and coordination. They never expected one tank to win a battle. It was always part of a relentless wave. When one IS-2 fell, another rolled forward to take its place. By late 1944, the effect of this weapon was felt across the entire Eastern Front. German morale was crumbling. Panzer crews began dreading the sound of the 122 mm gun almost as much as the explosions themselves. In letters home, soldiers described their helplessness. "We used to hunt them," one wrote. "Now we pray they don't find us first." The myth of German invincibility, built on the back of the Tiger and the Panther, was dissolving under the echo of Soviet fire. For the Red Army, every IS-2 that reached the front was a victory of endurance. Each one represented thousands of hours of labor, sweat, and faith that the tide could still be turned. And as they advanced through Poland, Belarus, and into the heart of Europe, these tanks became symbols of revenge and liberation alike. By the time the Soviets crossed into Germany, the IS-2 had achieved near legendary status. Villages whispered its name before it arrived. German civilians, hearing the thunder of its gun miles away, mistook it for artillery barrages. They didn't yet realize it was a single tank, a single shot, rewriting the course of history. The power of the IS-2 was not in its precision or engineering finesse, it was in its defiance. It was proof that a nation beaten, starved, and bloodied could rise again and create something so powerful that even its enemies would stand in awe. The firepower of the IS-2 was not just metal and powder, it was the sound of a wounded country roaring back to life. And that roar would not fade, it would only grow louder as the Soviets pushed westward toward Berlin, where the final echoes of that gun would mark the end of a war that began in arrogance and ended in fire. By the autumn of 1944, the German war machine was collapsing under its own weight. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, was now fighting for survival on two fronts, and nowhere was that desperation more visible than on the Eastern Front. The appearance of the IS-2 had not only shaken the Germans' confidence, it had shattered their tactical doctrine. What had worked for years no longer worked at all. The iron discipline, the calculated ambushes, the perfectly timed counterattacks, all of it began to fail in the face of a tank that simply refused to die. For years, German strategy relied on the superiority of its armor and the precision of its gunners. A Tiger could destroy a Soviet tank long before it came into range. A Panther could strike, retreat, and strike again. But the IS-2 broke that rhythm. It didn't play by the same rules. It could absorb punishment, close the distance, and fire back with devastating effect. The tactics that once defined German armored warfare were being rewritten by Soviet steel. At first, the Germans tried to respond logically. They developed new ambush formations, 3 or 4 tanks hidden in a tree line, waiting for the Soviet columns to advance. They coordinated with anti-tank guns and artillery. The moment an IS-2 appeared, they would fire from all sides, hoping to overwhelm it. But the Soviets had learned, too. The IS-2s never came alone. They were always accompanied by T-34s, infantry, and self-propelled guns. The first ambushes ended in disaster. The Germans would destroy 1 or 2 tanks before being wiped out by the crushing counterfire of the 122 guns. The balance had shifted irreversibly. Reports from the front grew increasingly desperate. "We cannot hold against these new tanks," one German commander wrote. "They advance as if our shells do not exist." Another reported that his unit had fired more than 20 rounds at an IS-2 from close range with no visible effect. Panic began to spread not through fear of the Red Army's numbers, but through fear of its machines. On the tactical level, the IS-2 forced the Germans to abandon the offensive spirit that had defined Blitzkrieg. The Wehrmacht, once the master of mobility and speed, was reduced to static defense. Instead of striking, it hid. German tank crews now spent more time waiting than moving, terrified of revealing their position. The IS-2's long-range firepower and armor made open-field engagements suicidal. Entire battalions began retreating before combat even began, leaving behind equipment and territory to avoid confrontation. This new reality was psychologically devastating. German soldiers had been raised on the myth of technological supremacy. They believed their tanks were the finest in the world, their tactics unmatched. But the IS-2 proved that belief false. When reports reached Berlin, the high command dismissed them as exaggerations, claiming that discipline, not equipment, was the problem. They were wrong. The problem was that German technology had reached its limit. In the past, whenever the Soviets introduced a new tank, the Germans answered with something better. The T-34 had brought the Panther, the KV had inspired the Tiger. But the IS-2 caught them at a moment when resources were gone, factories bombed, and skilled engineers either dead or drafted. The dream of endless innovation was collapsing along with the Reich itself. The Germans could no longer build their way out of defeat. On the battlefield, that defeat looked like chaos. At the front lines in Belarus and Poland, IS-2s led massive offensives that tore through German defenses in days. They didn't maneuver elegantly. They crushed everything in their path. Anti-tank crews who once stood firm at Kursk now abandoned their posts when the Soviet heavies appeared. The sound of the 122 gun had become synonymous with hopelessness. The IS-2's thick armor rendered even the most powerful German field guns nearly useless. The pride of the German arsenal, could only penetrate the IS-2 at dangerously close range, and even then, only if it struck the right angle. In practice, this meant the Germans had to let the monster approach within a few hundred meters, a suicidal proposition. More often than not, they fired too late, their shots bouncing off the sloped front while the IS-2 returned fire with devastating accuracy. The collapse wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional. German soldiers who had once mocked the Soviets for their crude weapons now whispered about their terrifying efficiency. The image of the Soviet tank had changed completely. From a lumbering hulk to a calculated instrument of destruction. Many veterans later admitted that facing the IS-2 felt different from facing any other tank. It wasn't just the power of its gun, it was the aura that surrounded it, the unshakable confidence of its crews, the sense that no matter what you did, it would keep coming. The Germans tried to adapt by focusing on mobility and flanking maneuvers. They deployed their remaining Panthers in small hunter-killer groups, attempting to circle the IS-2s and attack from the rear. But the Soviet doctrine anticipated this. IS-2s operated in layered formations, covering each other's weak spots. If a Panther tried to flank one, it would find itself in the sights of another. Every countermeasure the Germans devised was absorbed and neutralized within weeks. By the time the Red Army crossed into Poland, the IS-2 was spearheading entire corps-level offensives. They smashed through defensive lines that had taken months to build. In cities, they fired point-blank into buildings that hid snipers and machine guns, reducing entire blocks to rubble. German commanders began ordering their men to avoid direct engagements at all costs. Even Tiger battalions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were ordered to retreat if outnumbered by IS-2s. That single instruction marked the end of an era, the end of German armored dominance. One haunting moment captured the essence of that shift. During a retreat near the Vistula River, a German tank commander radioed his superior. "We are facing multiple IS-2. They are unstoppable. We are withdrawing." The response came coldly. "Hold your position." Minutes later, the line went silent. When scouts returned, they found his Tiger tank split open like a can, its turret blown off, and lying several meters away. The psychological effect rippled through the entire German army. The once proud panzer divisions, which had rolled through Europe with unstoppable force, were now reduced to pockets of resistance, reactive, cautious, and demoralized. The IS-2 had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of inevitability. Every time it appeared, it carried the weight of a nation that refused to die. Behind every Soviet advance, there was now a roar that the Germans could not silence. Their tactics, their pride, their doctrine, everything they had built the war on was collapsing. They had entered the Eastern Front laughing at their enemy's crude machines. Now they faced a steel leviathan that embodied everything they underestimated: endurance, simplicity, and the relentless will to fight. By late 1944, even the most loyal German officers could see the truth. The era of German tactical genius was over. The war of movement had become a war of survival, and the Soviets were no longer the desperate defenders, they were the executioners. The IS-2 didn't just destroy tanks, it destroyed the myth of invincibility that had sustained the Wehrmacht for years. And as those massive silhouettes rolled westward through snow and smoke, the once feared German army found itself running, not from men, but from machines that represented the vengeance of millions. The age of the Panzer had ended. The age of the IS-2 had begun. Before the IS-2 ever roared onto the battlefield, the Germans had already sensed that their dominance would not last forever. Even in 1942, when their panzers rolled deep into Soviet territory and victory seemed inevitable, there were signs, unsettling whispers from the front, that the Red Army's armor was evolving. Reports described strange, sloped tanks shrugging off direct hits. Engineers at the front wrote desperate letters to Berlin, urging the development of something new, something stronger. Those warnings gave birth to two of the most feared tanks in history, the Panther and the Tiger. The story of their creation was as much about fear as it was about innovation. When the Germans first encountered the Soviet T-34 in 1941, they were shocked. It was fast, well-armored, and had a deadly 76 gun that could penetrate their lighter panzers with ease. The T-34's design, its angled armor, wide tracks, and low silhouette was unlike anything in the German arsenal. Suddenly, the invincible Wehrmacht realized it was not the only army capable of engineering brilliance. Hitler himself took the reports personally. In a furious meeting, he demanded immediate action. "We must have a tank that can destroy the T-34, and we must have it now." The order set off a frantic race among German manufacturers. Henschel and Porsche, were tasked with developing a heavy breakthrough tank, the Tiger, while man began designing a faster medium tank inspired directly by the T-34's innovations. Within months, blueprints filled with ambition and arrogance were on Hitler's desk. The Tiger would be an armored monster with thick steel and an 88 gun, while the Panther would blend speed with sloped protection. Together, they would restore German supremacy. When the first Tiger I rolled out in late 1942, it was unlike anything the world had seen. Weighing over 50 tons and armed with the same 88 cannon that had terrified Allied pilots, it could destroy enemy tanks before they even came into range. Its armor was nearly impenetrable to Soviet weapons. The Panther, meanwhile, combined advanced mobility with formidable firepower. Its long 75 gun, capable of piercing any Soviet tank at long distances. For a time, these machines returned confidence to the Wehrmacht. Tank crews once again felt invincible. But with power came complexity. Both the Tiger and the Panther were over-engineered masterpieces of design, yet disasters of practicality. Their transmissions broke down after a few hours of combat. Their engines overheated. Their massive weight made bridges collapse beneath them and slowed their transport. Each Tiger required immense resources to build, and every mechanical failure was a strategic loss. The Wehrmacht had built perfection, but not sustainability. The Soviets, meanwhile, built the opposite. Their tanks were simple, efficient, and brutal. The T-34 could be repaired in the field with a hammer and spare parts. Factories could produce hundreds each month. By the time Germany finished one Tiger, the Soviets rolled out 10 T-34s. It was quantity versus quality, and in war, numbers often win. Still, the Tigers and Panthers struck fear into Soviet crews. When they appeared on the battlefield, they dominated, at least for a while. Entire Soviet platoons were destroyed before getting close. At Kursk in 1943, German armor inflicted enormous damage with its new beasts. But as the battles dragged on, the flaws became clear. The Tigers and Panthers were too few, too fragile, too demanding to maintain. When they broke down, they were often abandoned and destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. And capture them the Soviets did. Engineers studied the remains of these mighty machines, analyzing every bolt and weld. They admired the craftsmanship but saw its weakness, overcomplication. From those wrecks, they learned lessons that would shape their next generation of tanks. The IS-2 would be the Soviet answer, a rejection of over-engineering and a return to brutal simplicity. Where the Tiger was elegant, the IS-2 was elemental. Where the Panther was refined, the IS-2 was raw power. By the time the IS-2 arrived on the front, the Germans' technological edge had turned into a burden. Their machines were too expensive, too difficult to repair, and too scarce to matter. The Soviets, on the other hand, had built a weapon that could be mass-produced and feared equally. The IS-2's thick armor could shrug off the 75 shells of the Panther, and its 122 gun could obliterate a Tiger with a single hit. The Germans tried to evolve further. New projects were proposed: the Tiger II, the Jagdtiger, the monstrous Moss, each one more impractical than the last. Hitler's obsession with creating the ultimate tank pushed his engineers to absurd extremes. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was a masterpiece of armor and firepower, but it weighed nearly 70 tons, broke down constantly, and consumed fuel the Reich no longer had. It was a machine born of desperation, not strategy. On paper, the Tiger II could destroy an IS-2 at great range. In reality, most never survived long enough to do so. They ran out of fuel, got stuck in mud, or were bombed by Soviet aircraft before firing a single shot. What was meant to be the symbol of German supremacy became a symbol of its decay. The mighty designs that once inspired awe now represented a crumbling empire choking on its own perfectionism. The Soviets, in contrast, had no illusions about their machines. They didn't worship them, they used them. The IS-2 wasn't built to impress. It was built to end wars. It didn't need polish or prestige, only strength. While the Germans obsessed over engineering elegance, the Soviets embraced pragmatism. And in war, pragmatism always wins. Every battle between Tigers and IS-2s became a microcosm of the larger conflict, a clash between ideology and necessity, between arrogance and endurance. The Germans fought to preserve superiority, the Soviets fought to survive. That difference, more than armor or firepower, decided the outcome. By late 1944, the Soviets were winning that war of survival. The factories in the Urals were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The IS-2 rolled west in unstoppable waves, each one carrying the lessons of 1,000 broken T-34s. The Tigers and Panthers, those proud symbols of the Reich, began vanishing from the battlefield not in glory but in exhaustion. And so the story came full circle. The Germans had created their monsters to defeat the T-34. In the end, those very monsters inspired the creation of the IS-2, which destroyed them. It was the ultimate irony. German engineering, once unmatched, had forged the blueprint for its own defeat. In the ruins of abandoned factories, amid burned blueprints and half-finished prototypes, lay the last remnants of that dream of mechanical perfection. The Tiger and the Panther were technological marvels, but in war, survival favors not the beautiful, but the brutal. The IS-2 had proven that lesson on the smoking plains of the East. As the Soviets advanced toward Berlin, the ghosts of the Tiger and Panther lingered only as echoes of a bygone arrogance. Their creators had tried to outthink history, but history, as always, was written by those who endured, and the IS-2 roaring westward through mud, fire, and ruin was endurance made metal. By 1944, the war that Germany had once imagined would last months had turned into a storm it could no longer control. The Eastern Front, once a line of rapid advances and easy victories, had become a vast graveyard of machines and men. What began as Operation Barbarossa, the confident march of the Wehrmacht into the heart of the Soviet Union, had become a desperate retreat, and leading that retreat, pressing from the east like a hammer of steel and vengeance, was the IS-2. The appearance of the IS-2 was not just another tank on the battlefield. It was a symbol that the balance of the war had finally shifted. The years of humiliation, of retreat, of endless Soviet losses were over. Now it was Germany's turn to face what it had once inflicted. The thunder of the IS-2's 122 mm gun marked a new rhythm on the Eastern Front, the rhythm of reversal. The first major turning point came in the summer of 1944 during Operation Bagration. It was one of the most devastating offensives in military history, and the IS-2 was at its heart. The Red Army launched a massive assault across Belarus, aiming to annihilate Germany's Army Group Center. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers advanced, supported by thousands of tanks. Among them, the IS-2 spearheaded the attacks, crushing bunkers, strongpoints, and anything that dared to resist. German intelligence had underestimated the scale of the offensive. They believed the Soviets were exhausted after years of attrition, but the Red Army that attacked in 1944 was not the same army of 1941. It was smarter, better equipped, and infinitely more ruthless. The IS-2s moved at the front of armored columns, tearing through defensive lines like battering rams. Their guns obliterated entrenched positions, and their thick armor defied German counterfire. In a matter of weeks, Army Group Center, once the backbone of Germany's eastern defense, ceased to exist. Over 400,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. Entire divisions vanished. The map of the Eastern Front was redrawn in blood and smoke. For the first time, German officers began to whisper that the war might truly be lost. The psychological impact was immense. German troops who once mocked Soviet tractor tanks now fled at the first sight of an IS-2 silhouette. Even the mention of the Stalin tank spread fear among panzer crews. Anti-tank teams hid in forests, waiting to ambush, but the Soviet advance was relentless. It wasn't a war of finesse anymore. It was a storm of metal. As the Red Army pushed westward, the IS-2s became the spearheads of liberation and destruction. In Poland, they crushed the remnants of German defenses and rolled through towns reduced to ashes. Villages greeted them with mixed emotions. To some, they were saviors. To others, a new power rising from the east. But for the Germans, the IS-2 represented one thing only: inevitability. Another turning point came with the Vistula-Oder offensive in early 1945. The Soviet war machine had evolved into an unstoppable juggernaut, and its heavy tanks led the way. The IS-2 stormed across the frozen rivers of Poland, breaking through what was left of the Wehrmacht's defenses. German forces, stretched thin and undersupplied, simply could not resist. The once proud panzer divisions, which had ruled Europe, were now hunted shadows, retreating deeper into their homeland. In those final months, the IS-2 became more than a tank. It was vengeance made visible. Soviet crews painted slogans on their turrets for Kiev, for Leningrad, for motherland. Each shell that left their barrel carried years of rage, grief, and resolve. Every destroyed Tiger, every burning Panther was a message. The time of reckoning had come. The scenes on the ground were apocalyptic. German strongholds that had survived months of siege were erased in a single day by coordinated IS-2 assaults. Their 122 guns blasted holes through city walls. Their tracks crushed rubble, vehicles, and sometimes bodies indistinguishable in the chaos. For the Soviets, this was not cruelty, it was justice carved in steel. The IS-2 also proved instrumental in one of the war's most symbolic moments, the Battle of Berlin. By April 1945, the Reich was crumbling. The once proud streets of the German capital had become a labyrinth of ruins and fire. The IS-2s, designed for open fields and long-range combat, now thundered through narrow avenues, their barrels knocking down lampposts and their armor scraping against shattered buildings. They fought street by street, block by block, reducing German defenses to dust. Every corner held danger: Panzerfausts, snipers, and collapsing structures. But the Soviet crews were relentless. They fired through walls, turned intersections into craters, and advanced no matter the cost. The roar of their guns echoed off the stone facades of Berlin, drowning out the last cries of a dying empire. For the German civilians who hid in basements, the arrival of the IS-2 was the sound of the war's end. They had grown up hearing that German technology was unmatched, that their tanks were invincible, that the Reich would last 1,000 years. Now, through the smoke and the shaking ground, they saw the truth in the form of a steel monster with IS carved on its turret. Even German officers admitted their awe. After the war, many would write that the IS-2 had marked the point where the Wehrmacht's spirit broke. It wasn't just a tank, it was proof that the enemy they had underestimated had surpassed them in every way that mattered. The turning points of the war were not written by generals in offices, but by the clash of machines like these, by the moment when one tank's shell found its target and changed the morale of an entire front. The IS-2 was both a weapon and a message. That endurance, not arrogance, decides the fate of empires. In the ashes of Europe, one truth remained undeniable: the war that began with German laughter ended with German silence. The same soldiers who once jeered at Soviet machines now abandoned their own, in retreat, leaving behind wrecks of panzers smoldering in the mud. The thunder of the IS-2 followed them all the way to Berlin, the rhythm of history reclaiming its balance. When the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag, many of those who witnessed it remembered the sound that had guided them there, that deep, shattering roar of the IS-2's cannon. It was more than the sound of victory. It was the sound of everything the Soviet people had endured: hunger, loss, fear, being released in one final storm. The IS-2 did not win the war alone, but it became its heartbeat. Wherever it appeared, front lines dissolved, morale collapsed, and history changed course. It was not elegant, nor perfect, nor invincible, but it was relentless. And in war, that is what decides everything. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, the German dream of domination lay buried beneath the rubble of its own making. The IS-2 had done more than destroy tanks. It had destroyed the illusion that technology could save arrogance. And from the ruins of that illusion, a new world was born, one shaped by the roar of Soviet steel rolling through Berlin's broken streets. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. The cities lay in ruins, the skies blackened with smoke, and the ground littered with the carcasses of machines that once defined power. Among the twisted remains of Tigers and Panthers, one silhouette stood apart, the IS-2. It had rolled from the frozen steppes of the East all the way to the heart of Berlin, carving its name into the memory of a continent. The war had ended, but the legend of the IS-2 had only just begun. For the German soldiers who survived, the memory of facing an IS-2 never faded. In post-war memoirs, they wrote of the fear that crept into their ranks whenever its engine rumbled in the distance. "You didn't fight the Stalin tank," one veteran recalled. "You survived it, if you were lucky." Even years later, long after the surrender, the mere mention of the IS-2 brought back the sound of thunder, the smell of diesel and gunpowder, and the helplessness of firing round after round that simply bounced away. It was not just a tank, it was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong for Germany, the proof that their empire of precision and pride had fallen to endurance and sheer will. For the Soviets, the IS-2 became a symbol of triumph, but also of sacrifice. Every tank bore the weight of the millions who had died before it existed. Each victory, each shell fired, was built on the bones of soldiers and civilians who had refused to surrender. When Soviet troops paraded through Moscow in 1945, their IS-2s rolled down Red Square like metallic monuments to survival. Children cheered, veterans saluted, and the echo of their engines drowned out the ghosts of famine and fear. The war had forged them, but it had also scarred them. The world watched, uneasy. The IS-2, designed to fight one war, now became a symbol in another, the Cold War. Western generals studied it with respect and apprehension. Intelligence reports described it as a formidable. The Americans and British had their own tanks, but none carried the same psychological weight. The IS-2 represented a nation that had been pushed to the brink and clawed its way back through sheer determination. It wasn't just Soviet steel, it was Soviet defiance. In Eastern Europe, liberated cities saw the IS-2 as both hero and conqueror. Its tracks rolled through Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest, leaving behind not just freedom, but fear. The fear of a new power rising from the ashes. For the people who had endured both Nazi occupation and Soviet liberation, the sight of the IS-2 was complicated. It was salvation, but it was also a warning. History does not return what it takes. For engineers and historians, the IS-2 became an object of fascination. Did simplicity was its genius. It lacked the finesse of Western designs, yet it worked brutally, effectively, consistently. The 122 mm D-25T cannon remained one of the most powerful tank guns of its era, and its sloped armor influenced generations of post-war designs. Even the Americans quietly studied its construction when designing their future heavy tanks. The IS-2 had proven that brute power combined with practicality could overcome even the most advanced technology. But for those who drove it, it was more than a machine. Soviet veterans spoke of it with reverence, almost affection. They remembered how it felt to sit inside as the massive gun fired, the deafening roar followed by the smell of burnt powder and the shudder of metal beneath them. They remembered the camaraderie of their crews, the long nights repairing engines in the freezing dark, and the silence that followed after a battle when only the ticking of cooling metal filled the air. One commander, interviewed decades later, said quietly, "When you were inside an IS-2, you felt that nothing could stop you. Not because you were stronger, but because you had already lost everything you could lose." That was the soul of the IS-2, not arrogance, not pride, but endurance. As the decades passed, the IS-2 remained in service across Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It fought in Korea, Vietnam, and even in the early conflicts of the Cold War. Some nations used them into the 1960s, their old Soviet armor still rumbling through deserts and jungles thousands of kilometers from where it was born. It was outdated, yes, but not irrelevant. Its presence alone carried weight, a reminder of the age when the world learned what industrial resolve truly meant. Meanwhile, in museums from Moscow to Berlin, the IS-2 stood silent, a relic of fire and defiance. Visitors walked around it, studying its scars and welded patches, imagining the chaos it had once endured. Children stared up at the long barrel, wondering how something so massive could have been built by human hands. Veterans sometimes placed their palms on its cold armor, whispering names of friends who never came back. And somewhere in those steel echoes lived a paradox. The same tank that once terrified millions had also freed them from tyranny. They was both destroyer and liberator, monster and hero. History rarely gives such symbols a single meaning. The IS-2 was not the perfect machine. It was the necessary one. It represented what happens when survival demands not beauty or elegance, but brutal effectiveness. That was its legacy, not just fear, but respect. Even its enemies, years later, admitted that facing it had been like facing fate itself. It was the moment when the myth of German invincibility shattered, when the arrogance of precision bowed before the simplicity of determination. The IS-2's story was not written in the factories or the plans of generals, but on the scorched earth it left behind. In villages reduced to silence, in forests filled with rusting armor, in the memory of men who lived through the end of the world and saw it rebuilt from the wreckage. As time moved on, the IS-2 became more than history. It became a lesson that power is not about perfection, but persistence. That a nation's strength lies not in its machines, but in its will to endure. And so, when you look at the black and white photographs of that era, the smoke, the ruins, the silhouettes of tanks against the dawn, you can almost hear it again, the deep, thunderous voice of the IS-2 echoing across the broken plains of Europe. The laughter of the past had long faded. In its place, there was only the echo of steel and the quiet respect owed to the machine that ended an empire.